Welcome, and very happy that you can be with us. We actually have a very challenging Parsha this week. It just, if you know, every so often we come across against verses that seem to, insult our sensibilities. And this, of course, is the classic one, although we won't hit the actual verse. But there's going to be some eye-raising stuff, I promise you. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
And the parsha we're on is, as you can see, one moment, is Acharei Mot. And it's the parsha that starts off. It's the parsha we read on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, that talks about the high priest entering the Kodesh Kodashim. And right after that, pretty much, is all these laws about forbidding incest. What does the one have to do with the other? Well, quite a few years ago, it occurred to me that the high priest going into the Holy of Holies is an act of intimacy with the divine, and that of course the issue, and we know that it was only under certain circumstances that the high priest was permitted to do this. And likewise, we're now talking about intimacy between two people, and that is also very limited. I will also tell you something that of course, you're always welcome to disagree with me, but I will tell you that more and more I am feeling there is evidence about this, and that is that the act of sex is also something that carries with it many dangers and also issues that involve immortality. And that is the Tov Vara. Clearly, the idea that's back in Genesis, where we're actually studying that section right now, that the human being could have, the original person, this is, of course, from a literary point of view, could have lived forever, but in fact became a sexual human being, and that, of course, allowed for procreation. And that's
Rabbi?
Yeah, yes.
The part right before this that we finished
Yes.
last year
Yes.
is don't copy what they do in other
Right.
places.
Yes. Yes.
And fertility rites were very prevalent that
Mhm.
included sex.
Yes.
So that could be how we're segueing into that.
That could well be, but I think it's also
And
okay. I'm
in
sorry.
Egypt, people married their relatives.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Regardless, there is some evidence that people, especially men who are engaged in the porn industry, die very young. They tend to die very young. There've been some statistics involved in that. So the point is this: on the one hand, and in Judaism, it is the act of intimacy between a husband and a wife is considered something sacred, and wonderful, and in fact can be grounds for divorce if it does not take place. It's considered sufficient grounds. Having said that, though, there's still other limits, more limits than our current culture would like to see. So, at any rate, and I think there's a difference between being in love, which I don't think the Torah forbids. In fact, I think David and Jonathan is an example of that. But the act of sex is a different thing. It's a separate thing, and I know that we don't do that because we understand that the act of intimacy at its best is a beautiful expression of the love that two people have for each other. So I do understand this, and I realize I'm treading on very shaky ground here, but I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm simply I may be using judgment because I'm judging the Torah in terms of how it's being expressed, but I'm not trying to be judgmental, which I think is different. I realize that every one of us struggles with it, and every one of us has a yetzer hara, which is the way the rabbis describe this particular element, right? Lust. Okay. But lust is important, and it's not like lust is nothing but bad. It depends on how it's used and how it's disciplined. So anyway, enough. Oh, Lauren, please.
So lust, yeah, I understand um various types of immoral sexuality that when it's not connected to intimacy, but when we're talking about alternative relationships that are long-term healthy, you know, relationships that have a sexual component to them like any other healthy relationship, but not necessarily heterosexual. I think that if that's kind of illegal in Judaism, I mean, I'm confused. Is it like somebody has to make a choice to live their life in the way that's best for them and just kind of like eschew the Jewish religion if that was what they were a part of? Do they have to make that choice? I know they could also make the choice, and I know people who have, to try to live the most,
Right,
halachic life and
right,
not have sex with their partners,
right.
even if it's a life term commitment. But I'm wondering, is it that stark a choice, or can you make the choice to do kind of live as halachically as possible, have a relationship that's alternative, including sex, and just realize that um, you're doing as much as you can, but this is something that you can't live with, in terms of making that stark choice.
Right. So I think you posed it very beautifully in the fact that, this is something that actually occurs, of course, on every level. And I think you've defined it so well in terms of, the various parameters involved. So the answer is once you eat, and this goes for someone who converts to Judaism, this is discussed in the Talmud, that a person needs to be very careful about making that choice because once you're Jewish, you can never undo it. So the way they put it is Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisrael hu, that an Israelite, despite the fact that they've sinned, is nevertheless an Israelite. And that goes for anything. Yes, it's true. This is considered to be an extremely significant thing. I would say that it is limited to coitus, meaning that if two people of the same gender, same sex, want to show other signs of intimacy, that is, or affection, I don't believe there's any prohibition about that. It is talking only about that particular expression of it. Having said that, I also want to say that I really believe that this is a very personal matter. And I think that each person has to try and deal with it in the best way they understand, on their level of understanding, et cetera, et cetera. And to answer sort of the basic question you're saying is that I feel that it is possible to try and live your life as a halachic Jew, meaning that you're trying to follow the mitzvot as best as you can and perfectly as you can, and yet you have issues that may be contravene the words of the Torah and the traditional understanding of the Torah. But the truth is we all have that. It may not be in that particular area, but there are all kinds of areas where we are far from perfect in terms of our doing that. And so it's more, I see it more as an effort to try and do the best you can. And of course, it does say, the words of Micah, right? Only to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk modestly, right? So you do the best you can. And walking modestly doesn't just involve sex, it involves other things as well. And so I think that, I'm hoping that, how you expressed what you expressed, and hopefully my response as well is something that, alleviates a lot of pain that I think is involved in all of this, and that's tragic pain. I consider it tragic pain. And if you want to clarify this more, please feel free to respond to what I said. Are you able to, or someone else? It's fine. Anyone who wants to, just if you can raise your hand or just speak. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to go into the text then, but feel free if there was some reason you couldn't respond at this moment, at any point, please to do so. Okay. So here we go. I think these are more things that would be acceptable, but please understand, it really has to do with So these are not things that, in a way, cannot be highly affected by a culture. So let me go to the text. Ervat avicha, the nakedness of your father, the ervat imcha, and the nakedness of your mother, lo tigale, you shall not expose. And notice the way in which the Torah expresses this, right? It expresses it in terms of the nakedness. When you think of nakedness, go back to Adam and Eve when they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they became aware of their nakedness. And that has to do, of course, with one's sense of what it is, one's gender, one's sexuality, etc., and exposing those sexual organs that give a person a sense of shame, etc. And it's saying this is not, so that's the level of intimacy. It doesn't say you can't hug your father. It doesn't say you can't hug your mother. It doesn't say you can't rub their shoulders or give them a kiss or anything like that. Of course, we would not consider, certain kisses appropriate, oral kisses appropriate with immediate family. But regardless, the Torah wants to state very clearly, or maybe subtly, I don't know exactly what it's talking about. Lo tegale ervata. So again, interestingly, this seems to be superfluous. You shall not expose her nakedness, right? Because it's already said this, right? It says the nakedness of your mother you shall not expose. And now it's she, sorry, I did not translate this. Imcha hi, she is your mother, you shall not expose her nakedness. So it's clearly emphatic about this. Let's take a look at the Rashi. The interpretation of these verses, by the way, is it's at least the beginnings of a closer halachic analysis. So ervat avicha, what does it mean when it means the nakedness of your father? This is in the Talmud. Zo eshet avicha. This is actually means your father's wife. And of course, it doesn't sound like that. That isn't the way, in a first impression of that verse would understand it, right? So they ask, O eino ela kamashma'o. Well, but maybe, let's argue this out. Let's debate this. That's debatable. Maybe it does just mean what it says. Ne'emar kan. So the proof that it really refers to your father's wife, which may not be your mother, you understand. Your father's wife may not be your mother. She may not be any blood relationship to you, okay, herself. Ne'emar kan. In this context, it says, ervat avicha, it says, the nakedness of your father, v'ne'emar lahalan, and later on it says, Leviticus 20, verse 11, ervat aviv gila. In that context there, okay, it is very clear it is talking about the father's wife. And it goes on to say after that, this is in terms of punishments, by the way, later on. Here are the warnings, the prohibitions. Later on, the punishments are mentioned. So it says, Arvat aviv gila. He exposed the nakedness of his father. Ma lahalan eshet aviv. Just as in that context, it is very clear that it's referring to the wife of his father, afkan eshet aviv. So we understand that here it also means the wife of his father. So it doesn't mean your father's own nakedness. So going on, ve'ervat imech, ervat imcha, excuse me, the nakedness of your mother. Lahavi imo, this is to include his mother, she'ena eshet aviv, who is not technically the wife of his father, right? In other words, a woman who was raped or seduced by his father, who is not his father's wife, but nevertheless is his mother. Okay. So again, and by the way, this is very legalistic, I understand, but in that sense, the legalism, of course, is to clarify, right? Part of legalism involves making sure that there aren't loopholes in which people can find excuses to do things that they shouldn't be doing, or loopholes to avoid doing something they should be doing. So, right. Going on. Next verse. Ervat Eshet Avicha Lo Tegale. So now it seems to be saying the same thing, right? We just interpreted this, but here, look. The nakedness of the wife of your father, Lo Tegale, you shall not expose. Ervat Avicha He, she is the nakedness of your father. Let's take a look at this. This is begging interpretation. So, Ervat Eshet Avicha, the nakedness of the wife of your father. Isn't that the same as we just read? No, lerabot la'achar mita. That is to include even after he died, after his father died. And the reason why we understand this is that we have another law which we haven't come across yet that forbids a person, a man, to marry two sisters. And you will see later on that doesn't necessarily limited to simultaneously. It also means even if he divorces the one sister, he cannot go and marry the other sister. However, if the first sister dies, he can marry the other sister. So we want to make sure we cover such cases because this is possibly a loophole, right? Okay, onwards. Okay. Ervat achotcha. Okay, so the nakedness of your sister, bat avicha, whether the daughter of your father, in other words, half sister, or vat imecha, or the daughter of your mother, in other words, half sister by the father, half sister by the mother, moledet bayit, whether she, this is of course going to be an idiom, born in the house, or moledet chutz, or born outside, lo tegale ervatam, you shall not expose their nakedness. Notice the repetitious nature of this, which is trying to be very, very, very explicit and clear about this. And part of the reason for the need for that is because there are circumstances where it is clearly permissible. And because it's permissible under certain circumstances, it has to be, the Torah has to go out of its way to be very clear about those circumstances where it isn't permissible. And
in what circumstances is it permissible?
If there's no relationship whatsoever, right? Women marry men, and men marry women in permissible circumstances all over the place.
Siblings or half siblings.
And beyond, and just going into that, right? But other situations, right? So here we go. But sorry, go ahead.
I am not following. You are saying that they're avoiding loopholes. They're pointing out loopholes and closing them up.
Right.
And they're making distinctions between what is or isn't. Are you saying there's some situation in which a sibling is permissible? I didn't follow this.
Okay. The one example I gave was marrying two sisters, where under certain circumstances, where the first sister died, you can marry the remaining sister, the surviving sister. You can do that. But short of that, you are not allowed to marry her sister. As long as she is alive. And you could have divorced her, she could have remarried, but you still can't marry her sister. The only circumstance there's the example. Now, all these particular ones are universal pretty much.
What about Rachel and Leah?
I know. That's a very good, believe me, that is a classic question. So that was before the Torah was given. Okay. That's the reason why that was able to take place. There are exceptions, but those are, remember, That's part of a story. And not to say that it didn't happen, but that was prior to the Torah being given. Okay.
It's the exception that proves the rule.
I know, that's the truth.
But it's like we already learned this lesson. Let's just, keep that going. It was not pretty,
Okay. You mean the situation where Jacob
Between the sisters, yes.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't. It
Yeah.
wasn't. Although there are interpretations. By the way, what really isn't pretty, and what I like to say in these circumstances is, had Jacob wound up, who did Jacob want to marry?
Rachel.
Correct. Who would he have wound up marrying if Laban hadn't tricked him?
Rachel.
Correct. That would have been it. That would have been the end
Right.
of the story. Okay.
Yep.
So it wasn't like he was looking to marry two sisters,
No, he wasn't.
No. But nowadays,
And the concubines on top of everything.
yeah.
Who were probably also
Oh, by the way, I've read interpretations that say they actually were sisters of
half
concubines.
sisters or something.
Correct.
Yeah.
That they were half sisters. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. Right. But notice, by the way, no other circumstances do patriarchs do that. Abraham and Isaac did not do that, although actually Abraham did marry. He had a levirate. We've discussed this. Had, in a sense, a levirate kind of situation. And by the way, there's an example of because you're going to see you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. So we're going to get into this. So let's keep going. We're doing this. We're still in this verse 9. Bat avicha, the daughter of your father, right? Your half sister. Af, and here is the point why this mentions this. Af bat anusa b'mashma. This also is to be understood as referring to the daughter of a woman he raped. Anus means forced. Okay. And of course, rape itself carries with it penalties, but you don't necessarily abort the child. Okay. Moledet bayit. Okay, what does that mean? That was a cryptic statement, right? Born in the house. What does that mean? Or moledet chutz, or born outside. And here's the explanation. Bein shenolda me'ota, whether or not she was born of the one she'omrim lo la'avicha kayem et ima, even if she was born of a woman to whom they said to the father, you should, you can remain married to her. Okay. In other words, because in some circumstances you realize, in a case, for example, especially of seduction, okay, that he could remain married to her because the marriage was legitimate. Uvein she'omrim lo hotze et ima, or whether legally he is not allowed to marry her. He cannot remain married to her. Kagon, and he gives an example: mamzeret, a woman who's a mamzer, or netina, or a netin. These are technical terms referring to certain classes. In other words, we know that a mamzer is actually, this is something discussed, by the way, in rabbinic literature. There is some disagreement as to what defines a mamzer. There's some really, really very high standards. That is not the general standard. Basically, the accepted understanding is a mamzer is the person, the child born of one of these incestuous marriages that are forbidden, from a union of that is the child. And I realize that raises a whole other issue of the child having to pay the price, as it were, of what the parents have done, right? A nitin there's a story behind that, and that is that when Joshua entered the land of Canaan, he was commanded to wipe out the Canaanites who were there, right? There were, of course, exceptions to that, but primarily, and this is, of course, another issue. Oh, look at all these issues, eyebrow-raising issues that are being brought out in our lesson today, right? At any rate, there was a group of people that were, of course, concerned about that, and they came to Joshua. What happened was they sent some emissaries. They put on old clothing and worn out shoes, and they put dust on themselves. And they said to Joshua, you know, we've come from a far distance, which was an absolute lie, and we want to make sure that we have a treaty with you. And Joshua, of course, thought that in fact they were not Canaanites, that they came from a far distance, and he agreed to that treaty. And later on, just a little later on, they saw that these people were actually living next door, practically, you know, metaphorically. And so he brought them back and he said, you just made a deal on false pretenses. He said, we're not going to go back on the deal, but from now on, you're going to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, etc. You're gonna pay a price for this. Again, I'm not here to discuss the legitimacy or whether this is ethical or not. That's a whole different kind of issue. But at any rate, they were known as nitinim, and they were not allowed to marry Jewish, Israelites. I will tell you though, and if you smile, I hope you do. The fact of the matter is that a person who is a mamzer technically can in fact find ways in which to marry legitimately and have his or her children as legitimate Israelites. There are ways in which to do that, so that in fact even a high priest could be a descendant of a mamzer. So just interesting. That is possible. So, for example, if a woman who's a mamzer, who's the offspring of such a marriage, and is able to marry an Israelite that's sort of like a half Israelite, their child can be Israelite ultimately, and then marry an Israelite, etc. Golda?
Yeah, I feel that is the worst thing you can call somebody.
I know.
I know, because in my family, someone used to call them that, and then that person would say, "Oh, they were love words," and I'm thinking, "No, you don't understand what that means, apparently."
Okay,
Yeah.
Golda, let me say
Yes.
this. Sometimes in Yiddish, that is actually a type of euphemism. And so, for example, sometimes a really beautiful and lovely child is called a miskite, which means ugly in
Oh,
Yiddish.
well, that's a whole different. Yeah, I
Well,
understand
so I'm
that.
saying sometimes it's used in that way. And of course, if a person doesn't understand that cultural norm, they can be very insulted by it. And
Yeah.
it's not that I have actually heard it. I have to tell you truthfully, I've never heard anyone being called a mamzer in that loving kind of way. But knowing that it is, in fact, I have heard it used in terms of miskite, that it's possible. At least it's possible. Yeah,
Yeah, I can
okay.
understand that, but not in this particular
I know.
case.
By the way, there
Unfortunately,
is
it was awful. It
right.
just horrible.
What I'm going to do, because I know two other people want to participate, so I want to just mark the place if I may for tomorrow. Let me do that, and we'll stop here. I'll stop the share, and that way I'll see who raised their hand, because I cannot see it. I think we did
Let
that.
David go first.
Okay, let me just stop this though, please. Okay. All right. Okay, I'm going to share. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
No, I don't think I raised my hand, did I?
I don't know. Lauren,
Actually, your
apparently.
hand is raised, but
Oh,
that's okay. Oh, you know what? You know what? My hand is raised. It's showing it in your square because of the compact nature of the phone. Sorry.
Okay, so my notes said two participants raised their hands. It could have
That
still
was
been
Golda
Golda.
and
Yeah.
Lauren.
Okay, go ahead. Well, I saw Golda.
Okay, I just wanted to say, and this is not necessarily going to be totally fair to say, but it's just factual. So I was looking etymologically at the word bastard, and it turns out its origins were descriptive, but not what's the word there? They weren't meant to be
Derogatory.
right. Descriptive, but not derogatory. That was a later thing that happened. And I know that, like with Golda's family, it's possible that they did mean it derogatorily. But all I'm trying to say is that there are three ways that it could be meant. One could be a term of endearment, one could be derogatory, and the third could be neutral but descriptive.
And that's the way it is in the Bible, by the way. The Torah, it's simply a description, okay? It is not necessarily derogatory.
I can understand it that this person took it that way because she
yes, of
loved the
course.
person who said it,
Uh,
but yeah, because
oh,
there
but
was
can I?
yeah.
So, I know. Let me explain something. I
Yeah.
believe that the source of that is the
Mhm.
reason for doing it, is against the evil eye. That this came from a
Oh
superstition.
no, I can get that.
That by not doing, by saying this, you could avert the evil eye. And I'm pretty sure that that's what the origin is of doing this kind of thing, of saying just the opposite
Yeah.
of what you mean by using a
Oh,
word
she's
that's
so ugly. Yeah. Poo, poo, poo.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Okay, so that's that. The other thing
Now,
is,
Rabbi, you and I will tell you this story
yes,
later, but it
okay,
was not good.
okay, okay. I
Okay.
appreciate that. Before I leave this altogether, Golda, the fact is that there is a worse word, okay, that is derogatory, and that's the word sheketz, which has been used in Yiddish as shegets, okay, and that,
Oh,
yes, that means
I've heard. Yeah, I've
the
heard that one too.
Hebrew. It's a terrible thing. People should never use it. It means detestable. That's what it means.
That's just all it means. You're a detestable thing, huh?
Yeah.
Ugh,
Not
okay.
good. Not good.
Yep.
I don't want to end on this.
No, it's but
But
people
it
do
is.
say nasty things to other
They
people,
do.
unfortunately.
So
It
that
do.
goes for shiksa too.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
That's the feminine form.
That's
That's the
that's
feminine
right.
form
I
of it.
just wanted to
Oh,
point
right.
that out to
right.
people who might not
Right.
know.
Right.
Mhm.
Lauren, though, what's interesting is that people do use that, do not think they're saying anything. They don't understand the meaning of it, right? And
Right.
they don't mean it other than, in a descriptive way. And they don't have
No,
heavy derogatory context. They
they
should.
just mean it was somebody not in the tribe,
Correct.
On the one
Correct.
hand,
Yeah,
though, words do evolve in
Yes, they
terms,
do.
yeah.
based on usage and intention. So, if moms it has become mostly derogatory as opposed to its origins, then that's the way it is. And if
I agree.
this has
I
become
agree.
a little bit neutralized, then that's the way it is. So, but
Lauren,
it's not unfair to point it out. I mean, the word
No.
"jip," I always point out to people, has racial connotations and should not be used to be synonymous with cheating or stealing.
Hmm.
yes,
So I mean, word usage is sometimes a little bit, if there means that you feel you should correct it, you should correct it and say, hey, that the origin of this is that, but
And
people
it's
don't
probably
always
something
mean
you
it
should
that
take
way,
out of
because
your vocabulary.
yes.
people don't always mean it that way because there are popular usages and they don't always know. And in fact, when I
Mm,
heard the word Jew used as a verb and I corrected it, people were so apologetic, it never occurred to them
No,
that it was
right.
a slur. It
right.
just was part of their language. And
Mhm.
So let me end this session by saying, quoting what I've said so many times: circumstances alter cases.
Cases.
do they though?
Okay. All right. I'm going to stop the
The
recording.
slur is in the ear of the behearer.
There we go. Okay.